Hey everyone! Tonight, we're diving into some incredible true stories, from medieval peasants surviving brutal winters, to lost ancient cities, and revolutions that changed the world. If you enjoy deep dives into history's hidden moments, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss what's next. I'd also love to hear from you. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Let's see how far this community reaches. Now, get comfortable. Dim the lights. Let's begin. The unforgiving cold. Forget everything you think you know about a good night's rest. In the medieval world, sleep was a bizarre, communal, and often uncomfortable ritual, governed by necessity and superstition. Before electricity and modern schedules, people followed a segmented sleep cycle. As dusk fell, they would retreat to their beds for the first sleep, lasting roughly 4 hours. Then, they would naturally wake in the dead of night for a watchful period known as the watch. This hour or two wasn't seen as insomnia, but as useful, productive time. People used it to pray, tend the fire, check on livestock, read by candlelight, or even engage in intimate conversation with their spouse. It was a time of quiet reflection and practical chores. After this interlude, they would return to bed for their second sleep until dawn. This pattern was so ingrained that it was casually mentioned in literature and diaries. Modern research suggests this biphasic rhythm may be more natural to human biology, disrupted only by the artificial light and rigid timetables of the industrial era. So, the next time you find yourself awake at 2 a.m., remember your medieval ancestors. They wouldn't have panicked. They'd have simply whispered, "The watch has begun," and gone to stoke the fire. The medieval bed was a far cry from our cushioned, hypoallergenic havens. For peasants, a bed was often a straw-stuffed sack called a pallet, laid directly on a damp earthen floor or on a simple wooden frame. It was itchy, lumpy, and a paradise for fleas, lice, and the occasional field mouse. Whole families slept together in one space for warmth, with personal privacy being an unheard of luxury. The wealthy fared better, with grand wooden frames, feather mattresses, and embroidered linens. These beds were such valuable heirlooms they were listed in wills. Yet even in castles, drafts were common, and pests were a universal plague. Sharing your bed wasn't limited to family. At roadside inns, travelers were expected to share sleeping space with complete strangers. Beds became communal property, with 2, 3, or even 4 people sleeping side by side. You learned to sleep lightly, often using your travel pack as a pillow to deter thieves. From the noble's feather mattress to the peasant's straw pallet, the medieval bed was less about comfort and more about survival. A place to avoid freezing, hoping you wouldn't be bitten or burgled before sunrise. That in a world of drafty stone walls, bedtime required gear. That nightcap wasn't a drink, but a literal hat, a long, pointed cloth cap worn to prevent precious body heat from escaping through the scalp. Made of wool or linen, it was a practical necessity for all. Though wealthier individuals might have embroidered versions, sleep was also a spiritually perilous time. The darkness was filled with threats, both real and supernatural. Bedtime prayers were not soothing rituals but urgent pleas for protection, often including the grim verse, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." People believed they could die in their sleep at any moment, and they wanted to face judgment with a clean soul. Dreams were taken with deadly seriousness. They were not random neural firings but messages, from God, saints, or demons. A vivid dream could be a divine vision or a demonic temptation, requiring interpretation by clergy or even acts of penance. To dream was to walk a thin line between revelation and corruption, making the night a journey fraught with spiritual danger. In cold, one-room peasant homes, animals were more than pets, they were heating systems. Dogs, chickens, and even the family pig might sleep in the same space, or even on the same straw, providing vital warmth through the night. This cozy arrangement came with drawbacks, noise, smells, and a lack of personal space, but it was a trade-off for survival. At the other extreme were monastic dormitories. Here, monks slept in austere, silent halls on hard wooden planks or thin straw mattresses. They slept fully clothed in their robes, ready to rise for prayer. Comfort was seen as a distraction from devotion. The most dramatic interruption was the canonical hour of matins. A bell would shatter the silence around 2 a.m., summoning the brothers from their slumber to the icy chapel for hours of psalms and prayers by candlelight. Falling asleep during this service was a punishable offense. This rigid cycle of segmented sleep, icy vigils, and self-denial framed sleep not as rest, but as another form of spiritual discipline in a life devoted to God. The winter of 1692 in Salem Village, Massachusetts, was bitter, but an even deeper chill had taken hold, a paralysis of fear. The Puritan community, already strained by politics, failed crops, and frontier wars, was primed for a spark. It began in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris. His young daughter, Betty, and niece, Abigail Williams, began suffering violent fits, screaming, contorting, and claiming to be pinched by invisible forces. A local doctor, finding no physical cause, delivered the unthinkable diagnosis: witchcraft. That single word unleashed a tidal wave of dread. In a world where the devil was a daily threat, the idea that he had infiltrated the minister's own household was terrifying. The afflicted girls, under intense pressure, began to name their tormentors. First, they accused the usual outcasts: Tituba, the enslaved Caribbean woman in the Paris household; Sarah Good, a homeless beggar; and Sarah Osborne, a woman who defied social norms. But with Tituba's coerced confession of a tall man in black and other witches in Salem, the floodgates opened. Accusations snowballed from the marginalized to the respectable, driven by old grudges, land disputes, and sheer panic. The village was caught in a web of its own making, where a pointed finger could become a death sentence. Part 6: The Machinery of Hysteria, Spectral Evidence and the Court. To manage the crisis, Governor William Phips established a special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, to hear and to determine. This court abandoned traditional legal safeguards, allowing a dangerous form of testimony: spectral evidence. Spectral evidence meant that if an accuser claimed to have seen the ghostly shape or specter of the accused which tormenting them, it was admissible in court. The accused had no defense against an attack only the victim could see. The performances of the afflicted girls, their screams, seizures, and visions, became the primary evidence. The trials were a spectacle. There were no defense lawyers. The accused stood alone. If they denied the charges, the girls writhed in agony. If they confessed and named others, they might be spared. The system incentivized lies and destroyed the innocent. On June 10, 1692, Bridget Bishop became the first to hang on Gallows Hill. The executions accelerated. 5 women were hanged in July, including the pious and elderly Rebecca Nurse. The hangings reached a grim crescendo in September with 8 executions in a single day. Giles Corey, refusing to enter a plea, was pressed to death under heavy stones. By the time the frenzy subsided, 19 people had been hanged, 1 pressed to death, and at least 5 more died in squalid jails. Over 200 people stood accused. The gallows cast a long, dark shadow over New England. The hysteria finally began to crack when accusations targeted the powerful and respected, including the governor's own wife. Public opinion turned as respected ministers denounced spectral evidence. In October 1692, Governor Phips dissolved the vengeful Court of Oyer and Terminer. A new, more skeptical court was formed. Spectral evidence was rejected, and in the sober light of day, the cases collapsed. Acquittals became common, and the remaining prisoners were eventually pardoned. The storm had passed, leaving a shattered community. In the aftermath, the silence was filled with guilt and grief. Some accusers, like Putnam Jr., later publicly apologized. Judge Samuel Sewall stood in church to confess his guilt and seek forgiveness. Slowly, the colony made restitution to some victims' families, but the damage was irrevocable. Salem's story is a timeless cautionary tale. It shows how fear, when weaponized by authority and amplified by groupthink, can overpower reason, justice, and compassion. It warns of the fragility of truth in the face of panic. The phrase, "witch hunt," endures because the lessons of Salem, about due process, the danger of hysteria, and the cost of unchecked fear, remain hauntingly relevant, a stark reminder from the past to guard against the tyranny of the mob. In the violent twilight of the Roman Republic, one woman refused to remain in the shadows. Fulvia, born around 83 BCE, was no ordinary Roman matron. She was a political force who shaped history through 3 strategic marriages to Rome's most turbulent radicals. Her first husband was the populist firebrand Publius Clodius Pulcher. With him, Fulvia learned the art of street-level politics. After his murder, she didn't retreat. She turned his funeral into a public spectacle, parading his body to incite riots that burned the Senate House itself. It was her debut as a master of political theater. Widowed, she married Gaius Scribonius Curio, a leading supporter of Julius Caesar. Through him, she anchored herself in the heart of the civil war between Caesar and Pompey. When Curio died in battle, Fulvia emerged once more, a resilient widow with a growing network of power and loyalty. Her final and most famous marriage was to Mark Antony. As Mark Antony's wife, Fulvia acted as his de facto regent in Rome while he campaigned abroad. She managed his alliances, rallied his veterans, and even appeared with him on coins, an unprecedented honor for a Roman woman. Ancient historians, scandalized, painted her as overbearing, but her real crime was wielding power like a man. In 41 BCE, with Antony distracted in the east, Fulvia took destiny into her own hands. Alongside Antony's brother, Lucius, she raised an army and waged war against Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, in what became the Perusine War. She was the first Roman woman to instigate a civil war, fighting to protect Antony's interests from Octavian's growing power. The gamble failed. Octavian besieged their stronghold at Perugia through a bitter winter. Facing starvation, they surrendered. Lucius was spared, but Fulvia was exiled. She fled to Greece, hoping for Antony's support, but found him entwined with Cleopatra. Broken in health and spirit, Fulvia died in exile in 40 BCE. Her death conveniently cleared the way for Antony's political marriage to Octavian's sister. Rome tried to erase her, branding her a dangerous shrew. But Fulvia's legacy is of a woman who dared to command legions and challenge the men who would become emperors, a formidable political architect in her own right. By the summer of 1963, the struggle for civil rights in America had reached a boiling point. The idea for a massive, peaceful march on the nation's capital was revived by labor leader A. Philip Randolph and master organizer Bayard Rustin. They envisioned a monumental demonstration for jobs and freedom. The logistical challenges were staggering. Rustin, a brilliant strategist, planned with military precision, coordinating buses and trains from across the country, arranging sound systems, water, and sanitation for a crowd they hoped would number in the tens of thousands. The Kennedy administration was deeply nervous, fearing violence, but the organizers guaranteed a disciplined, non-violent protest. On August 28, under a sweltering sun, they came. Not 100,000, but over 250,000 people, black and white, young and old, representing a cross-section of America, converged on the National Mall. The atmosphere was not one of anger, but of solemn, hopeful determination. They sang freedom songs, linked arms, and listened as speakers from every major civil rights organization outlined a vision for a just America. The rally proceeded with powerful speeches and songs from icons like Mahalia Jackson. But the crowd waited for one voice. In the late afternoon, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stepped to the podium at the Lincoln Memorial. He began with a powerful indictment of America's broken promises. Then, prompted by Mahalia Jackson's cry from behind him, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." He set aside his prepared notes. What followed was an extemporaneous sermon that would echo through history. "I have a dream," he proclaimed, weaving a vision of a nation where his children will not be judged by the color of their skin but by the content of their character. His voice, rising and falling with prophetic rhythm, painted a picture of a future built on justice and brotherhood. He closed with the old spiritual, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, "We are free at last." The crowd erupted. They knew they had witnessed more than a speech, it was a defining moment for the movement and the nation. The March on Washington did not bring immediate change, but it created an unstoppable momentum. It showcased the power and discipline of nonviolent protest to the world. Within a year, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964, followed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, legislation directly fueled by the moral clarity of that day. King's "I Have a Dream" speech became the beating heart of the movement's legacy, a benchmark for justice. Yet, the march's full demands, for economic equality, a living wage, and an end to police brutality, remain urgent and unfinished. Today, the dream is both a monument and a mandate. It lives on in ongoing struggles for racial and economic justice, reminding us that the march is not a closed chapter of history, but an open invitation. The legacy of that hot August day is a challenge to every generation, to continue marching, striving, and building until the promise of freedom and equality is a reality for all. The echoes of the March on Washington did not fade with the departing crowds. In the short term, the movement's leaders met with President Kennedy, who was moved by the march's dignity but whose civil rights bill remained stalled in Congress. Tragically, just weeks later, the brutal reality of racial hatred reasserted itself with the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, which killed 4 young girls. The dream had been spoken, but the nightmare was not over. The march's true power was as a catalyst. It galvanized public opinion, showing a national television audience the profound moral weight of the civil rights cause. This shift created the political space for President Lyndon B. Johnson to forcefully champion and sign the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Furthermore, the model of peaceful, mass mobilization became a blueprint for social movements across the globe, from anti-apartheid struggles in South Africa to pro-democracy rallies worldwide. However, the march also exposed fissures within the movement. Younger, more radical activists grew impatient with the pace of change and the philosophy of nonviolence. The focus on legislative victory, some felt, overlooked deeper issues of systemic poverty and structural racism. The dream was a powerful beginning, but the harder work of building the beloved community, today, the physical legacy of the march is etched into the American landscape. The Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial stands proudly on the National Mall, its stone of hope emerging from a mountain of despair, directly aligned with the memorials to Lincoln and Jefferson. King's likeness gazes across the tidal basin, his words from that day and others carved into the granite surrounding him. But the truest monument is intangible. The phrase, "I have a dream," is woven into the fabric of global culture, a shorthand for hope and justice. The march is remembered not just for King's oratory, but for the powerful image of 250,000 people demanding change with disciplined grace. It represents a peak of interracial solidarity and moral clarity in American history. Each year on its anniversary, and during subsequent marches for justice, the spirit of August 28, 1963, is invoked. It serves as a touchstone, a reminder of what is possible when people organize across lines of difference to confront injustice. It is a legacy that empowers and obligates, asking each new generation, what is your dream, and what are you willing to march for? To understand the Salem witch trials, one must first feel the texture of fear that defined life in 1692. Salem Village was a tense, fractious place. A recent split from the more prosperous Salem town bred resentment. Failed crops and a smallpox epidemic created economic anxiety and a sense of divine punishment. Ongoing frontier wars with native tribes left the community traumatized and paranoid, seeing threats in every shadow. Within this pressurized environment, Puritan belief held that the devil was actively plotting to destroy their city upon a hill. Any misfortune, a sick child, a dead cow, a spoiled batch of beer, could be interpreted as Satan's work. Social deviance was not just frowned upon. It was potentially demonic. This was a world where the supernatural was real, imminent, and deadly. The afflicted girls, Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, and their friends, found themselves at the center of this maelstrom. Their fits, whether born of psychological stress, illness, or clever imitation, became the spark. In a community primed to see witchcraft, their convulsions were not a medical mystery but a supernatural assault. The diagnosis unleashed a communal exorcism that would quickly spiral beyond anyone's control. The first accused were society's vulnerable. Tituba, an enslaved woman from Barbados whose foreign customs and stories seemed suspicious, Sarah Good, a destitute, abrasive beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman entangled in a scandalous land dispute. They were easy targets, lacking the social capital to defend themselves, but the accusations soon climbed the social ladder, revealing the trials as a weapon for settling scores. Rebecca Nurse was a pious, elderly grandmother, widely respected. Her accusation shocked the community and revealed that no one was safe. Martha Corey was a devout church member. Her skepticism of the girl's claims made her a target. George Burroughs, a former Salem minister, was accused of being a ringleader of the witches. The accused faced an impossible choice. Confess, name others, and live, but damn your soul and betray your neighbors. Or maintain your innocence and face the gallows. The jails overflowed with the condemned, where many, like infant Sarah Good's 4-year-old daughter Dorcas, were broken by imprisonment. The human cost was not just in the hanged, but in the shattered lives, families, and the very social fabric of New England. The medieval approach to sleep was deeply intertwined with a worldview that blended classical science, religion, and folklore. The watch at night was not just practical, it fit a cosmic rhythm. Medical theory, based on the 4 bodily humors, suggested that digestion was better aided by sleeping propped up, and that different humors dominated different hours. The night itself was a spiritually charged time. It was the dominion of nocturnal humors, and the hour when ghosts, fairies, and demons were most active. The concept of the nightmare, from the Old English mare, a malevolent spirit that sat on sleepers' chests, was a real terror. Prayers before sleep were as much a protection against spectral attacks as they were preparations for death. This mindset made sleepwalking a terrifying phenomenon. It wasn't a sleep disorder, it was evidence of possession, a wandering soul, or demonic influence. Treatments were spiritual, amulets, herbs like St. John's wort, and prayers. To the medieval mind, the barrier between the waking world and the supernatural was thinnest at night, and every sleeper was a potential traveler in that. Studying medieval sleep patterns offers more than historical trivia, it holds a mirror to our own modern anxieties about rest. The pre-industrial segmented sleep pattern, documented in Europe and other cultures, suggests that our monolithic 8-hour block is a modern invention. Historian Roger Ekirch's research, which popularized this concept, argues that waking at night was once a normal, peaceful part of the human rhythm. This challenges our modern pathologizing of nighttime wakefulness. The medieval watch was a time for contemplation, intimacy, or minor chores. Today, waking at 3 a.m. often triggers anxiety about insomnia, creating a stress loop that prevents returning to sleep. The medieval model implies that perhaps our biology is simply remembering an older. Furthermore, the communal nature of medieval sleep, for warmth, safety, and social bonding, contrasts sharply with our culture of isolated, private bedrooms. Their experience underscores sleep as a deeply social and environmental act, not just a biological one. In seeking the perfect, individualized sleep hygiene, we may have lost something of the shared human security that defined rest for centuries. After her exile following the Perusian War, Fulvia's story reaches its tragic end. She arrived in Sicyon, Greece, not as a triumphant general but as a defeated rebel. Historical accounts suggest Mark Antony was furious at her for starting a war in his name, complicating his delicate politics with Octavian. He did not rush to her side. Plutarch writes that Fulvia fell ill and died, perhaps from a fever, but just as likely from what we would call a broken heart, a blend of shame, betrayal, and despair. Her death, in 40 BCE, was politically convenient for Antony, who promptly married Octavian's sister, Octavia, to seal a temporary peace. Fulvia was erased from the narrative, the troublesome wife whose ambition had caused needless strife. For centuries, history remembered her through the hostile lens of Roman historians like Cassius Dio, who called her a woman of no mean spirit but painted her as a domineering shrew. Yet, modern historians are re-evaluating Fulvia. She is seen not as an aberration, but as a logical product of the late Republic's chaotic power struggles, a brilliant political operator who used the only tools available to a woman of her station, marriage, patronage, and fierce intelligence. She was, in many ways, a Roman woman trying to play a Roman man's game, and for a time, she played it masterfully. From the straw-filled palates of peasants to the anxious prayers of Puritans, from Fulvia's command tent to the reflective pool of the Lincoln Memorial, these stories are united by a common thread: the human struggle for security, meaning, and justice within the confines of their time. The medieval peasant sought warmth and spiritual safety through a cold night. The Salem villager, gripped by terror, sought certainty in a world that felt besieged by evil. Fulvia sought power and agency in a republic that denied women a public voice. The marchers on Washington sought the promise of dignity long deferred. Each story reveals how people build rituals, whether of sleep, accusation, politics, or protest, to navigate their fears and articulate their hopes. They show how easily fear can curdle into persecution, and how courage can coalesce into world-changing movements. History is not just a record of kings and battles. It is the accumulated story of where, how, and why people slept, whom they feared, what they dreamed, and what they dared to demand upon waking. These intimate histories remind us that the past is never just past, it is the foundation of our present anxieties and aspirations, a continuous conversation across the centuries about what it means to be human. The medieval night was not silent. The architecture of sleep shaped its soundtrack. In the drafty great hall of a castle, the night resonated with the snores of dozens, knights, servants, and hounds, all sharing the rushes-strewn floor. The stone amplified every cough, every turning body, every muttered dream. Guards' footsteps echoed from the battlements, a rhythmic reminder of vigilance against the dark. In the peasant's cottage, the sounds were closer, more intimate. The rustle of straw, the snuffling of a pig by the hearth, the scuttle of thatch-dwelling insects, the cry of a child. The wind whistled through gaps in the wattle-and-daub walls. These were not disturbances, but the white noise of security, proof that the household, both human and animal, was together and alive. To sleep through this cacophony was to be part of its rhythm. In an age before alarm clocks, people were woken by the crowing of the cock, the first birdsong, or the monastic bell, nature and ritual dictating the tempo of life. That in the pre-industrial world, sleep was inextricably linked to labor and light. The working day was defined by sunlight. In summer, people rose earlier and retired later. In winter, sleep occupied a larger portion of the 24-hour cycle. The segmented sleep pattern fit this organic rhythm. The watch often coincided with necessary tasks, stirring the embers of a fire to last until morning, checking on a laboring animal, or completing quiet, firelit crafts like mending or spinning. Sleep was also a commodity. For the poor, a shared bed in an inn was a necessary expense. For the wealthy, a grand bed with curtains and a feather mattress was a display of wealth as potent as a fine horse. Your ability to sleep safely, warmly, and privately was a direct measure of your social standing. In this context, the modern concept of catching up on sleep would be nonsensical. Sleep was not a bankable resource, but a daily negotiation with darkness, temperature, and security. The end of the trials did not bring closure. Salem village was a community poisoned by suspicion. Neighbors who had accused each other now had to live side by side. Families of the executed lived with a burning sense of injustice. In 1697, a day of fasting and repentance was declared. Judge Samuel Sewall stood in his church while his confession of guilt was read aloud, a rare, powerful act of public contrition. Over the following decades, the colony slowly attempted to make amends. In 1711, a bill was passed reversing the attainders against many of the condemned and awarding £600 in restitution to their families. The names of Nurse, Corey, and others were formally cleared, Though the process was incomplete and the financial compensation meager, the deeper wound was to the Puritan theocracy itself. The spectacle of ministers and magistrates condemning the innocent based on spectral evidence profoundly damaged their authority. The trials marked the beginning of the end for the rigid, fear-based religious rule in Massachusetts, paving the way for a more secular legal system. Salem became a permanent warning about the dangers of mixing unchecked religious fervor with the language of witch hunt has survived for over 300 years because the dynamics that fueled Salem remain hauntingly familiar. It is invoked in politics, media, and social life to describe any situation where fear, groupthink, and moral panic lead to the persecution of a scapegoated minority. The core ingredients are timeless: a community under stress, real or perceived, a defining ideology that divides the world into pure and impure, an authority figure lending credence to fears, and a target whose otherness makes them a plausible vessel for the community's anxieties. Salem teaches us that the process does not require actual witchcraft, only the belief in it. Modern parallels can be seen in the Red Scares, internment camps, and various moral panics. The trials stand as a stark lesson in procedural justice, the danger of hearsay evidence, the necessity of the right to face one's accuser, and the vital importance of a presumption of innocence. They remind us that justice is not self-executing. It is a fragile system that requires constant vigilance against the primal force of fear. Though Roman history tried to bury her, Fulvia's spirit did not die. She established a template for female political power in Rome that would be followed, though rarely equaled, for centuries. Her daughter, Clodia, married Octavian, Augustus, briefly uniting the bloodlines of Antony and his rival. While that marriage ended in divorce, it demonstrated how elite women were used as pawns, and sometimes players, in the dynastic games of the new empire. Later imperial women operated in the space Fulvia helped carve. Livia, wife of Augustus, wielded immense influence from the domestic sphere, advising on policy and succession. Agrippina the Younger maneuvered ruthlessly to make her son, Nero, emperor, even allegedly murdering her husband, the Emperor Claudius. While these women rarely took up arms as Fulvia did, they mastered the arts of patronage, conspiracy, and public image, governing from the palace shadows. Fulvia's most direct echo might be Empress Galla Placidia in the 5th century CE, who, as regent for her young son, personally negotiated with barbarian kings and ruled the Western Roman Empire with a firm hand. Fulvia proved that a woman's role was not confined to the domus, household, it could extend to the residential publica, the state itself, setting a precedent that would flicker through Roman history until its end. The March on Washington did not end segregation or racism. Instead, it built a bridge, a moral and rhetorical bridge, from the struggle for legal equality to the ongoing fight for true equity. The Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts were monumental achievements, but as Dr. King himself would say in the years after the march, they were insufficient. He turned his focus to economic justice, opposing the Vietnam War, and tackling poverty in the North, recognizing that racism was a systemic disease, not just a Southern problem. The march's legacy is thus twofold. It is the iconic, triumphant image of the dream, a moment of peak national conscience. But it is also the starting line for the harder, less photogenic work that followed. Movements for fair housing, educational equity, criminal justice reform, and economic parity are all continuations of the journey that converged on them all. When John Lewis, the young SNCC firebrand who spoke at the march, returned decades later as a revered congressman to lead a sit-in on the House floor for gun control, he was walking the same path. The dream is not a museum piece, it is a living, demanding ideal, its fulfillment requiring new marches for new times. What binds these narratives across millennia? They are all explorations of how humanity confronts the unknown. The medieval night was a literal and supernatural unknown. The Salem witch trials were a terrified lashing out at the unknown source of community distress. Fulvia navigated the unknown chaos of a collapsing republic. The civil rights marchers confronted the unknown territory of a just and multiracial democracy. In each case, people used the frameworks available to them, religion, law, marriage, nonviolent protest, to impose order, seek safety, or demand change. The methods range from the tragic, the gallows, to the triumphant, the dream, but the impulse is universal, to move from fear to security, from oppression to agency. History, in this light, is not a straight line of progress. It is a spiral. We see similar patterns of fear and courage, persecution and resilience, repeating in different eras. By studying the intimate details of how people slept, whom they blamed, and what they dared to hope, we see not archaic curiosities, but reflections of our own time. We understand that the questions of how we live together, how we govern justly, and how we find rest in a troubled world are the eternal human questions. The answers we weave, from the straw of our palates to the words of our dreams, become the fabric of history itself. Modern sleep science offers a fascinating postscript to the medieval segmented sleep pattern. Research by historians like A. Roger Ekirch, supported by sleep studies, suggests this biphasic pattern is not an anomaly but a natural human rhythm. In environments devoid of artificial light, the body's circadian drive for sleep is strongest after dusk and just before dawn, with a maintenance wakefulness period often occurring in between. This period is governed by a drop in core body temperature and a surge in the hormone prolactin, associated with restfulness, creating a state of quiet, meditative alertness, the perfect biological state for the watch. The industrial era, with its demand for unbroken factory shifts and the invention of cheap, pervasive artificial light, effectively suppressed this rhythm, enforcing the monolithic 8-hour block as the new norm. This understanding reframes modern sleep disorders. Waking at 2 a.m. with anxiety, often called sleep maintenance insomnia, may be, in part, a physiological echo of this older pattern clashing with the cultural expectation of uninterrupted sleep. The medieval response, to get up, reflect, or do a quiet task, might be more natural than lying in bed stressing about lost sleep. Sleep was never just a personal act, it was a moral and social battleground. Medieval religious authorities preached against sloth, warning that excessive sleep was a sin that could lead the soul to damnation. Monastic rules strictly regimented sleep as part of spiritual discipline. In the industrial era, the narrative shifted. Long, unbroken sleep became a marker of efficiency, productivity, and good citizenship. The good worker was well rested and punctual. Conversely, those who slept at odd hours or in public spaces were viewed with suspicion, as lazy, immoral, or vagrant. This control over sleep patterns became a tool of social order. The Puritans of Salem, for instance, would have seen aberrant sleep, like the fits of the afflicted girls, as potential evidence of diabolical influence. Thus, how and when you slept was a visible sign of your alignment with societal norms, making the regulation of rest a subtle form of power. The witch trials were not a random contagion, they followed the fissures in Salem's social landscape. Historians mapping the accusations have revealed a stark pattern. The accusers were largely from the poorer, agrarian Salem village, while the initial accused were often from the more prosperous, mercantile Salem town or were aligned with its interests. Many witches were people on the wrong side of property disputes or who had opposed the influential Putnam family. The accusations, then, served as a violent form of social reordering, a way for one faction to dispossess and destroy another under the cover of divine justice. The affliction spread along lines of kinship and alliance, showing how fear could weaponize existing grievances. It was less a supernatural plague and more a deadly outbreak of long-simmering local politics. Most of what we know about Fulvia comes from historians writing decades or centuries after her death, and almost all were hostile. Cicero, her contemporary enemy, mocked her in his letters. The later historians Plutarch, Cassius Dio, and Appian wrote under the Roman Empire, which owed its existence to her enemy Octavian, Augustus. Their accounts have a clear agenda, to paint Antony as weak, controlled by a woman, and Octavian's rise as righteous. They describe her as cruel, ambitious, and manipulative, epithets rarely applied with such venom to ambitious Roman men. When they recount her examining the severe head and hands of Cicero, a victim of the proscriptions, they aim to horrify. Yet, stripping away the bias, the story still reveals a woman actively participating in the brutal politics of the triumviral period, not shrinking from its violence. The challenge with Fulvia is to hear her story not through the scandalized whispers of her enemies, but through the undeniable facts of her actions. She raised armies, minted coins, and shaped history. The impact of the March on Washington reverberated far beyond American shores. Images of peaceful, massive protest and Dr. King's potent oratory were broadcast globally, providing a powerful template for oppressed peoples. Anti-apartheid activists in South Africa, like Nelson Mandela and Albertina Sisulu, drew direct inspiration. In Northern Ireland, civil rights activists adopted similar songs and tactics of nonviolent demonstration in the late 1960s. In Eastern Europe, dissidents circulating samizdat, clandestine, literature referenced King's "I Have a Dream" speech as a vision of freedom against totalitarianism. The march demonstrated that moral authority, when broadcast to the world, could pressure even the most entrenched powers. It helped internationalize the struggle for racial equality, making it a global yardstick for justice and human rights, and proving that a domestic movement could have a profound foreign policy impact by reshaping America's image abroad. In all these narratives, the bed, whether of straw, feathers, or political marriage, was a crucible for alliance. The medieval peasant family huddled together with their animals for survival. The shared-in bed was a temporary pact of mutual necessity between strangers. For Fulvia, her marriages were strategic mergers, each bed a command center for a new political campaign. In Salem, the breakdown of community meant the metaphorical bed of neighborly trust was shattered, replaced by suspicion that your closest neighbor might be a secret enemy. The March on Washington, in contrast, was about building a new kind of national alliance, a symbolic joining of hands across racial and geographic divides to share the dream of a better country. In each case, who you slept with, trusted, or broke bread with defined the boundaries of your safety and your power. These stories are not isolated chapters. They form an unbroken, if tangled, chain. The medieval fear of the dark and the unknown psychic terrors that fueled Salem share a common root in humanity's struggle to explain misfortune. The political machinations of Fulvia in a crumbling republic find echoes in every power struggle where marginalized groups fight for a seat at the table, a fight vividly embodied in the March on Washington. The quest for a safe night's rest, for a community free from scapegoating, for personal agency, and for societal justice are all part of the same fundamental human project. We study the lice in the straw pallet, the false testimony in the Salem meeting house, Fulvia's bold coins, and the sea of faces on the mall, not to dwell on the past, but to better understand the architecture of our present. They remind us that progress is not inevitable, that fear is a potent toxin, and that courage is often found in the most ordinary acts, going to bed, speaking out, refusing to name names, or simply getting on a bus to march toward a dream. History is the story of these choices, repeated and refined, in the endless human pursuit of a more restful, just, and awakened dawn. The transition to sleep in the medieval world was a deliberate ritual, a defensive operation against the perils of darkness. As twilight fell, the household would engage in locking in, securing animals, banking the central hearth's fire to preserve embers until morning, and barring doors with heavy timber. In wealthier homes, servants would prepare braziers for warmth and ensure candle supplies. The act of undressing was minimal, most people slept in their daywear or a simple linen shift. The final and most critical ritual was prayer. The Compline service in monasteries formally marked the day's end with psalms asking for protection. Families recited prayers together, invoking guardian angels and saints like Saint Christopher or Saint Barbara to stand watch. This wasn't mere habit, it was spiritual armor, a necessary fortification before surrendering consciousness in a world where the veil between the physical and spiritual was believed to be thinnest at night. While the primary accusers in Salem were girls and young women, they were not alone. Several men and boys also fell into fits and made accusations. Most notable was John Indian, the enslaved husband of Tituba, whose performances of torment fueled early accusations. Young boys like 17-year-old Thomas Putnam Jr. and even respected men like John Hale's parishioner, John Willard, initially supported the trials. This broadens the understanding of the hysteria. It was not solely a gendered phenomenon of hysterical girls, but a community-wide psychological contagion. Social pressure, the desire for attention, genuine psychosomatic illness, and in some cases, strategic opportunism, created a feedback loop. The affliction became a powerful, legitimizing role. The one who was visibly tormented by evil held immense, albeit terrifying, social capital in a society desperate to identify and purge its sins. Amidst the frenzy, brave voices spoke out at great personal risk. Prominent among them was Thomas Brattle, a wealthy Boston merchant and scientist. In a courageous letter circulated in October 1692, he systematically dismantled the court's methods, mocking spectral evidence as the devil's testimony and pointing out the absurdity of the confessions. He argued the trials violated the fundamental principles of English common law. In Salem itself, a small group resisted. Philip and Mary English, a wealthy merchant couple, escaped jail and fled to New York. Most famously, a farmer named John Proctor, whose wife Elizabeth was accused, defiantly challenged the proceedings, calling the accusers liars and demanding an outside court. His outspokenness sealed his fate. He was hanged in August. These dissenters, often overlooked, were the first to apply reason to the panic, planting the seeds for the eventual collapse of the A. Key to Fulvia's influence was her vast independent wealth. As an aristocratic Roman woman, she controlled a significant fortune inherited from her family and previous husbands. This money was not passive, it was her war chest. She used it to bankroll Clodius's street gangs, fund Curio's political campaigns, and, most crucially, raise and pay Antony's legions during the Perusine War. Her ability to mint coins bearing Antony's image and her own name was not just symbolic, it was a direct exercise of economic and state power, typically a male prerogative. Her wealth allowed her to act autonomously, to be a patron in her own right, binding soldiers and clients to her loyalty. In a society where money was the lifeblood of politics and war, Fulvia's control of the purse strings made her a power broker no man, not even Antony, could afford to ignore completely. Behind the iconic male leaders of the March on Washington stood a cadre of brilliant, tireless women organizers without whom the event would have failed. Dorothy Height, president of the National Council of Negro Women, worked tirelessly behind the scenes but was notably excluded from the main speaking program. Anna Arnold Hedgeman, the only woman on the planning committee, fought to include a tribute to women and successfully pushed for the inclusion of white speakers and performers to emphasize integration. Ella Baker, a veteran organizer and former executive director of the SCLC, embodied the grassroots philosophy that empowered local movements. While she was skeptical of top-down, charismatic leadership, her network building was essential. These women handled logistics, fundraising, mobilization, and negotiation, mastering the unglamorous work that turned a dream into a historical event, even as the spotlight remained fixed on the men. The soaring hope of August 1963 was soon tempered by brutal reality, proving the march was a peak, not a plateau. The Birmingham church bombing weeks later was a horrific reminder of violent resistance. The following, Freedom Summer, of 1964 saw the murders of civil rights workers Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. The Selma to Montgomery marches in 1965 were met with Bloody Sunday violence. Dr. King's own philosophy evolved, moving beyond civil rights to confront the triple evils of poverty, militarism, and racism, which alienated some former allies. His assassination in April 1968 felt like the shattering of the dream itself, sparking nationwide riots. This period illustrates that profound social change is never a linear ascent. It is a jagged path of advance and backlash, where every hard-won victory reveals new depths of the struggle and demands renewed, often more complex, forms of courage. The medieval experience of sleep continues to shape modern culture in subtle ways. The archetype of the witching hour, midnight to 3 a.m., persists as a time of supernatural danger and introspection. Our ghost stories and horror films often feature nocturnal hauntings, a direct descendant of the medieval belief in night-prowling spirits. The concept of the night watch survives in security guards, nurses, and parents tending to infants, a shared understanding that the night requires sentinels. Even our idealized vision of hygge, or cozy comfort, a fire, a warm drink, a safe nook, is a sanitized, aestheticized version of the medieval fight against the cold, dark night. Our relationship with the dark is still mediated by centuries-old instincts and fears, layered over with technology but never fully erased. From the straw pallet to the National Mall, these stories chart humanity's struggle to define community, justice, and rest. The medieval villager, the Salem accuser, the Roman matron, and the civil rights marcher were all, in their own contexts, seeking agency within systems that sought to confine them, whether by the strictures of feudal hierarchy, Puritan theocracy, patriarchal republicanism, or Jim Crow. Their tools were the tools of their time: prayer, accusation, marriage, nonviolent protest. Their failures, the persecutions, the wars, the betrayals, highlight the catastrophic cost when fear overcomes empathy and power corrupts principle. Their triumphs, moments of solidarity, courage under threat, and visionary leadership, remind us of our collective capacity for renewal. Ultimately, history is this collection of nighttime vigils and daytime marches. It is the story of us, trying to sleep safely, to name our demons accurately, to claim our rightful power, and to walk, together, toward a brighter dawn. The past whispers its warnings and its encouragements, the future waits to see what we will.